Continue our human relations course on communication, and this one will focus on the differences and similarities among the 7 general types of nonverbals. So we are getting into 7 types of nonverbal communication, and they are listed here on this slide, and then the subsequent slides will delve deeper into each one of them. So, the 7 types of nonverbal communication, and these will allow us to more fully understand the challenging aspect that is nonverbal communication. And they include space, time, body movements, touch, paralanguage, artifacts, and lastly, environment. So we'll start off talking about space. And space, when we're talking about nonverbals, include the space that we have between and among people and between objects and people. And when we're talking about business communication in organization, space is very often associated with social rank, meaning hierarchy. And because of that, it's quite important, right? So we assume or read a lot of different things from how things are laid out and spaced out in organizations, such as who gets the corner office. Is there a corner office even? Does the leader sit amongst the employees or not? Why is the head of the table important and who sits there, etc.? And of course, this one has a cultural component, meaning people from different types of cultures have a different normative space expectation. So in some cultures, it's generally more acceptable to have larger distances among or between people. And in some cultures, it's more accepted, it's normative to have the space be less and people are comfortable close to each other. The gentleman Edward T. Hall was the one originating the field of proxemics, which is the study of the human use of space and distance in communication. The human use of space and distance in communication. And he said, or he concluded, that there are 2 different aspects of space when we are talking about nonverbals. Number 1 is territory, and number 2 is personal space. So for territory, that is related to control. This is the space that you claim to be your own space. You are responsible for this space, and this is something that you're willing to defend. And we know, and we have seen, that powerful people typically claim more space, and other people give them that space. So the more power you have, the more space you're able to claim. Number 2 is personal space from Edward T. Hall. And he defined that as the bubble. And that's probably something you've heard about before. So the bubble of space surrounding a person. How much of that bubble is around somebody. And that's our personal space. Hall also articulated 4 main categories of distance that we use in communication. And so this figure is from your textbook. And you see here on the graph, there are 4 circles from the small orange to the largest green one. So the small one indicates intimate space, and that's where you have people where you are intimate with. The second, slightly larger bubble is the personal space, right? So that's the personal space we're comfortable with. The third, blue, slightly larger bubble again is the social space with people we are social with. And lastly, the largest bubble is the public space. And so there's different type of distances we are comfortable with depending on who the person is. Is it somebody there's an intimate relationship, a personal relationship, a social relationship, or just out and about in the public? Then we come to time. How aware we are of time varies, of course, by culture. And again, we have normative expectations of how we treat time and we adhere to time. So I am Swedish, I grew up in Sweden, and so I'm very punctual and I like to be early because that is part of our culture. I have colleagues that I work with from other cultures and their adherence of time is not the same. So they are comfortable being late to a meeting, which I would be very uncomfortable with. I do run late, of course, because life happens, but it's very stressful for me to be running late. So clearly, some cultures are very, very time oriented. And your book gives the example of railways, right? So the trains in Germany are famous for being literally on time. And in other countries, such as Argentina, it's more of a suggestion if the train is said to leave at 10:10. Well, that's what we are thinking. It might not leave at 10:10. Then we have the study of chronemics. This is the study of how we refer to and perceive time. And so we all perceive and refer to it differently, so we call that chronemics. Then we have Tom Bruno, who was investigating throughout his entire life. He was very interested in how time interacts in communication and culture. And he noted that across Western culture, Western society, we always say that time is money. Time is money. And we value it in the short term as such. And so we are always in a hurry. We're impatient, type A personalities, slightly workaholic. And in other culture, there's more of a respect for slowing down and taking the long-term view of time. So as we are working with people from different parts of the world and different cultures, it's important to pay attention to the fact that we value time differently. And of course, technology has changed most people's view of how long it would take or should take somebody to respond to you, whether that's over text, email, etc. We anticipate answers much more quickly now than we used to. Moving on to body movements. So we call this kinesics, difficult for me to pronounce. That is the study of body movement. And there are 4 different body movements that we can talk about. And in one of the earlier videos, I talked briefly about these. Complement, repeat, regulate, or replace. And they all have different functions for enforcing or changing your verbal messages, so the words that you are speaking. So for instance, when we're talking about complimenting, now we are complementing through body movements the verbal message by somehow reinforcing what we are saying. So if you're providing an orientation presentation, for instance, to a client about some technological program or software program, you might say something like, click on this tab, and then you initiate that action. Here you're complementing what you're telling your client by doing it yourself, right? So the action complements the words. You can also reinforce a message by repeating it. So we are now repeating something a couple of times, and that repetition will help the listener more fully understand the message. Movements can also regulate conversation. So you can nod to indicate that you're listening so that the speaker goes on, or you can hold your hand up and signal to them to stop. So we are regulating conversations to stop or to continue, to go slower or to go faster. Body movements can also substitute or replace what you're saying. And so it has been found that we can use our face, for instance, to communicate our feelings, right? Our face oftentimes communicate our feelings quite a bit. And our body movements tend to indicate how intensely we experience those feelings. Are you crawling up in a ball, or are you opening yourself up and standing tall? You're communicating different things through these body movements, as was found by the researchers Ekman and Friesen. Ekman pronounced in Swedish. So learning how to gauge feelings and their intensity as expressed by people around you, it takes time, of course, because we don't know immediately what somebody's saying through their body language. But as you spend time with them, paying attention to them, you will improve your ability to have these positive interactions as you're learning to read body language, and also as you are learning to use your own body language to help with your verbal communication. Now we are going to talk about touch relatively briefly. And when we talk about touch in communication, we call that haptics. Haptics, H-A-P-T-I-C-S, haptics. And we have William Salier and Melissa Beal, and they identified 5 different types of touch, ranging from impersonal to very intimate, and they are listed in this table here. So those 5 distinct types of touch are listed here. So the first one is called functional, and this is your professional touch, and this would be taking place like in physical therapy, if you go to the doctor's office, or maybe if there's a music teacher that you're learning to play the piano with, and that's a functional touch. Number 2 would be a social touch. That's polite touch, such as a handshake. At least before COVID, we used to shake hands a lot, at least in our Western culture, and we will see if that maybe changes now post-pandemic or endemic, in the endemic world. Number 3 is a friendship. This is a little bit closer. This is more warmth and caring in the touch, and an example might be a hug. Number 4 would be love. So now we're getting even more closely into that warmth area. And here we talk about intimacy. So with love, we have intimate touches such as kissing between family members or romantic partners. And lastly would be sexual touch, which is arousal. And this is somebody you're in a romantic relationship with, some type of romantic relationship, such as sexual caressing. So those are the touch types. Paralanguage. Paralanguage is actually the exception to the definition of nonverbal communication. So here we're going to be, talking a little bit about nonverbals, but it also actually includes verbals. So earlier we actually defined nonverbal communication as not involving words at all, but paralanguage actually exists when we speak using words. So paralanguage involves verbal and nonverbal aspects of speech that influence the meaning of the speech. And that includes things such as your tone of voice, the intensity by which you speak, whether or not you pause when you're speaking, and even the use of silence. And so you might have heard of people talking about pregnant pauses. And this is literally the silence that occurs between verbal messages. And even though it's a silence, there is some sort of meaning in that silence. And it might be kind of confusing, and it will be hard to understand sometimes what the meaning is in that silence. We just know it's there. There is some meaning there. So the example from your textbook here is that you have a coworker, they're coming back from a meeting, and they're quite speechless. They're quiet, they're white in their face, and you're thinking, oh, what happened here? And so you ask your coworker, hey, how did that go? Did the meeting go okay? And the answer you get back is, well, and then they're quiet. Your coworker is quiet. So even though nothing is said, you know that there's something going on. And we would call that a pregnant pause. So these types of silence or vocal pauses can communicate a lot of different things, right? They can communicate hesitation, pausing to just gather our thoughts. Sometimes even it serves as a sign of respect. So we use silence as part of our communication. And there is a quote from your textbook, and the textbook even says we don't know who actually said it. But it is not the case that a person who is silent says nothing. Rather, silence does communicate things. So even when people are quiet, that is an answer, or that is some sort of meaning with that silence. Basso and Phillips, a couple of communications researchers, did find that traditional speech among Native Americans places a special emphasis on silence. So again, there are, of course, cultural aspects to this. Artifacts are forms of decorative ornamentation that we choose to represent ourselves. So artifacts represent one's self-concept. Artifacts can include things like rings, tattoos, earrings, clothing, brand name logos, cars, watches, purses, anything that we choose to surround ourselves with that tells the world something about ourselves and something about our sense of self. These artifacts can communicate a lot of things about us, maybe things such as our gender or our role, our class or our status, or our group membership or affiliation. So we look at people, we look at the artifacts that they have chosen, and we make assumptions or we draw conclusions based on that. Sometimes those are correct and sometimes they are not. And that's something we call stereotyping. So understanding the artifacts that someone chooses to wear can help us understand who they are and help us understand more about them. And it can be a great conversation starter. I really like that purse. Where did you get it? Right? And they can tell you the story. And maybe you can find some common ground to communicate around. And then we now have arrived at the environment. So the environment in an organization or everywhere, but here we are in a culture of business. The environment involves the physical and psychological aspects of the communication context. And so the perception of one's environment around us also influences how we react to it. So for instance, your book talks about Google, and Google is very famous for its work environment. They have different spaces that are created for different things, including physical activity and eating. They have food service around the clock. And surely this is costly. It's not cheap for Google to do this, but if you take a look at Google's stock price, we know that these actions are probably the right ones, because the result that Google has been able to come to through its environment is astounding, right? So Google has created an environment that is designed to facilitate creativity and interaction and collaboration, and they seem to be worth the effort. And we do know that as of today, people are working from home, and we will see, right, if that physical aspect will change. Right now that people are not in the office interacting with each other, how will that change, or how might that change things such as creativity, interaction, and collaboration? I think the jury is still out on that. So in summary, nonverbal communication can be categorized into 7 different types, and they include space, time, body movement, touch, paralanguage, artifacts, and environment. That's it for now. Until next time. See you soon.